It started like any other evening. The sun was just beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the quiet neighborhood. The air was still, almost peaceful, but in a matter of seconds, that peace would be shattered. Keisha Williams, a young black woman in her mid-20s, was driving home after a long day at work. She was 7 months pregnant, exhausted, and just looking forward to putting her feet up. Her hands rested gently on the steering wheel, her mind half focused on the road and half drifting to thoughts of her unborn child. But then, flashing, red and blue lights filled her rearview mirror. Her stomach tightened. She wasn't speeding. She wasn't doing anything wrong. So why was she being pulled over? With a deep breath, she signaled and pulled to the side of the road. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached for her purse, making sure to have her ID and registration ready. Her father had always warned her about situations like this. Stay calm, keep your hands visible, don't make any sudden moves. She had heard those words since she was a teenager. But right now, they felt heavier than ever. The officer stepped out of the patrol car and approached her window. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with a face carved out of stone, he looked like the kind of cop who had seen everything. But there was something else, something unsettling about the way he carried himself. His name tag read, Officer Reynolds. Keisha rolled down her window, her voice steady but polite. Good evening, officer. Is there a problem? Reynolds didn't answer right away. His sharp blue eyes scanned her face, then flickered down to her stomach. Something about the way he looked at her made her skin crawl. You were swerving, he finally said. His tone clipped. Swerving. That didn't make sense. She had been driving carefully, more cautiously than usual because of her pregnancy. Keisha opened her mouth to respond. But before she could, Reynolds reached for the door handle. Step out of the car, he ordered. Her heart pounded. Officer, Now, he snapped, his hand already drifting toward his holster. Fear coursed through her veins, but she forced herself to stay calm. With slow, deliberate movements, she unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. The cool evening air hit her skin as she stepped onto the pavement, her legs feeling unsteady beneath her. Reynolds didn't waste a second. He grabbed her wrist, hard. Too hard. Hey, she protested, wincing. What's going on? I haven't done anything wrong. His grip tightened. You look nervous. Got something to hide. Keisha's pulse raced. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. Please, I'm pregnant, she said, hoping those words would make him realize she wasn't a threat. But instead of easing up, Reynolds' expression twisted into something colder. You people always have an excuse. Those words hit her like a slap. You people, she echoed, barely believing what she was hearing. Before she could say anything else, Reynolds suddenly shoved her against the hood of her car. Pain shot through her belly as her body collided with the metal. Stop, she gasped, panic rising in her throat. She struggled, but Reynolds was stronger. His hands pinned her down, and for a terrifying moment, she thought he was going to, hey! A voice boomed from somewhere behind them. Deep, commanding, powerful. Reynolds froze. His grip loosened just slightly. Keisha, her breath coming in sharp gasps, managed to turn her head. A sleek black car had pulled up beside them. The door swung open and a man stepped out, tall, dressed in a crisp, dark suit. Eyes that burned with quiet intensity. The moment Reynolds saw him, his face drained of color. His whole body went rigid, like he had just seen a ghost. Keisha felt it too. Something had shifted in the air. Reynolds' hand twitched at his side. Sir, I was just... The man took a slow step forward. his presence alone enough to make Reynolds back up. His gaze flickered to Keisha, then back to the officer. His voice, steady as steel, cut through the night like a knife. "Do you know who I am?" And just like that, the power dynamic changed in an instant. The look on Reynolds' face said it all. He did know. And whatever he knew, it terrified him. But who was this man? Keisha, still breathless, had no idea what was happening. But one thing was clear. Her nightmare wasn't over yet. It was just beginning. For a long moment, the air felt thick, like the entire world had paused. Officer Reynolds stood there, stiff as a board, his hand twitching at his side. Keisha could see the uncertainty in his eyes. Whoever this man was, Reynolds feared him. And not just the kind of fear that came from surprise, but real, deep fear. The kind that made a person rethink every bad decision they'd ever made. Keisha's breathing was still uneven, her heart pounding against her ribs. Her belly ached from being shoved against the car, but she forced herself to stay upright. She had no idea what was happening, but she wasn't about to back down now. The man took another slow step forward, his presence alone making Reynolds instinctively step back. "You shouldn't be here," Reynolds muttered, barely above a whisper. His hands, once so forceful and sure, now hung awkwardly at his sides. Keisha narrowed her eyes. Why would a cop say something like that? The man didn't even blink. His gaze was locked onto Reynolds, cold and unreadable. "And yet, here I am," he said, voice smooth and controlled. Keisha felt a strange shift in the energy between them. This wasn't just some random encounter. There was history here, something deeper that she didn't understand yet. She finally found her voice. "Who is he?" she asked, her eyes flickering between the two men. Reynolds didn't answer. His throat bobbed like he was swallowing something bitter. The man in the suit, however, finally turned to look at her. His expression softened, but only slightly. "Are you all right?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was something behind it, an unspoken promise that if she said no, there would be consequences. Keisha swallowed hard and nodded. Yeah, I think so." The man's jaw tightened as he turned back to Reynolds. "You put your hands on a pregnant woman." His words weren't loud, but they cut through the air like a blade. Reynolds licked his lips, looking like he wanted to disappear. She was resisting. Keisha's anger flared. "That's a lie. I did everything you said." The man in the suit barely reacted, but something in his expression grew darker. "Lying too," he murmured. Not surprising. Reynolds tensed. "I didn't know who she was," he blurted, as if that somehow made it better. Keisha felt something click into place. She turned to the man beside her, realization dawning. "Who are you?" she asked again. This time more certain that the answer was important. The man studied her for a second, as if debating what to say. Then, finally he spoke. "My name is David Williams," he said. "I'm her father." Silence. Keisha's breath caught in her throat. Reynolds visibly paled. I didn't know." David took another step forward. "And now you do." Keisha felt her entire body go rigid. She hadn't seen her father in years. Their relationship had always been complicated, long absences, moments where he felt like a stranger rather than family. But she had always known one thing. David Williams wasn't just anybody. Reynolds knew it too. That was why he looked like he wanted to run. Keisha's mind was spinning. Her father had always been powerful, respected, and feared in certain circles. She had grown up seeing people straighten their backs when he entered a room, their voices suddenly measured and cautious. But why would a cop be this terrified of him? She glanced at Reynolds, who looked like he was trying to calculate his next move. I swear I wasn't trying to. David held up a hand. I'm not interested in excuses, he said, voice like steel. Reynolds clenched his jaw. She was swerving. I had a reason to pull her over. David didn't even blink. Then why did you escalate? Keisha felt her father's anger simmering beneath the surface. He had never been the kind to raise his voice or make empty threats. No, his power came from something else. The weight of his words. The way he looked at people, like he could see straight through them. Reynolds shifted on his feet, eyes darting around like he was looking for an escape. David took another step forward, closing the distance between them. What precinct do you work for? Reynolds swallowed hard. Listen, we don't have to. What? Precinct? The officer's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Beads of sweat had formed at his temple. David turned to Keisha, his voice gentle but firm. Did he hurt you? Keisha hesitated, feeling the ache in her body, the sting of being treated like a criminal for no reason. Yes, she finally said, her voice tight. He did. David nodded once, as if that was all he needed to hear. Then he pulled out his phone and started dialing. Reynolds' eyes widened. Wait, who are you calling? David didn't answer. He simply raised the phone to his ear, waiting for the other end to pick up. Keisha had never seen a grown man look so afraid. Reynolds' chest was rising and falling too quickly, his face slick with panic. Look, this doesn't have to go anywhere, he stammered. I can forget this happened. David finally spoke, but not to him. We have a problem, he said into the phone. I need it handled. Keisha's stomach flipped. She had no idea who he was talking to, but whatever was about to happen, it was bigger than just this moment. Reynolds took another step back. But before he could finish, David's eyes locked onto him one last time. You're done, he said simply. Keisha didn't know exactly what those words meant, but the way Reynolds' face crumbled told her everything. Whatever power her father held, it was about to change everything. Reynolds' face drained of color. His whole body seemed to shrink, like a man who suddenly realized he was standing on the edge of a cliff. His gaze darted between Keisha and David, searching for a way out, but there was none. Whatever power David held, it was clear. This was a battle Reynolds had already lost. Keisha stood frozen, her mind still racing to catch up. She had spent years keeping her distance from her father's world, but now she was right in the middle of it, and it was clear that whatever influence he had, it was far beyond what she ever imagined. Reynolds took a shaky step back. Look, I didn't know who she was. If I had known, David's stare was ice. And if she wasn't my daughter, what then? Reynolds opened his mouth, but no words came. Would she still be face down on the hood of her car? David continued, voice deadly calm. Would she still be gasping for air, begging you to stop? Keisha felt a lump rise in her throat. She hadn't even had time to process what had happened to her. The way she was handled, the way her voice hadn't mattered. But hearing her father say it out loud made the weight of it settle deep in her chest. Reynolds took another step back, panic flickering in his eyes. I made a mistake. David didn't react. He simply held the phone to his ear. Then, after a pause, he spoke into it. He's here. Come get him. Reynolds' breathing turned erratic. Wait, please. I have a family. I can't lose my job over this. David's expression didn't change. You should have thought about that before you put your hands on mine. The sound of approaching sirens filled the air. Keisha turned, spotting another police cruiser pulling up to the curb. But something about it was different. The officers who stepped out didn't look like they were here to back Reynolds up. In fact, they didn't even acknowledge him at first. Instead, they walked straight to David. One of them, an older black officer with a no-nonsense expression, gave a small nod. "Mr. Williams." Keisha's chest tightened. David nodded back. "Take him." And just like that, it was over. Reynolds barely had time to protest before the officers were on him. His arms were pulled behind his back, and for the first time that night, Keisha saw real fear in his face. The same fear she had felt when he grabbed her. The same fear she had felt when she was shoved against her car. "No, wait, I can explain," Reynolds yelled, struggling against the cuffs. "I didn't mean to." The officers didn't listen. Keisha watched, feeling an odd mix of emotions. Satisfaction, relief, but also something else. Something heavier. David turned to her. His expression softened slightly, the sharp edges of his rage easing just a bit. "You all right?" She let out a slow breath. "I think so." For a moment, they just stood there, watching as Reynolds was placed in the back of the police car. The man who had humiliated her, hurt her, treated her like she was nothing, was now powerless. Keisha looked at her father. "What happens now?" David studied her for a moment, then spoke simply. "Justice." It was the way he said it, like it wasn't a question, like it was a fact. Keisha had spent years keeping her distance from her father, avoiding the weight of his name, the shadow he cast. But tonight, for the first time, she felt something different. She felt safe. As the police car pulled away, Keisha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. The night air felt lighter now. David placed a hand on her shoulder, steadier and strong. "Let's get you home." And for the first time in a long time, she didn't hesitate. She just nodded and followed her father into the night, knowing that no matter what came next, she wouldn't have to face it alone.